I came home from work the same way I always did, keys jangling in my hand, shoes hitting the floor by the entryway. The house smelled of lavender, the kind of scent my wife always had in the air. It was comforting once. Tonight, it just made my chest feel heavy. The living room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the television. A forgotten episode of some sitcom played in the background, laughter echoing off the walls like a cruel joke. Her purse was thrown on the couch, and her shoes were lying near the coffee table, one flipped upside down. It looked normal, just another day in our house. But the normalcy didn't last long. I tossed my jacket onto the back of the chair and grabbed my phone to check the usual messages. That's when I noticed her phone sitting on the kitchen counter. Its screen lit up with a notification. Normally, I wouldn't have given it a second glance. But this wasn't just any notification. It was a Tinder message. The name on the screen read Dylan. A name I didn't know, a name that had no place flashing on my wife's phone. My hand hovered over it, and for a second, I thought maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe it was a joke, or maybe someone had the wrong number. I wanted that explanation, needed it, but my gut told me otherwise. Curiosity, and something darker, took over. I swiped the notification open. The message was short, but it was more than enough to unravel me. I had a great time last night. Can't stop thinking about you. Let's do it again soon. The words bled into my mind, hot and stinging like they'd been carved there. My breathing quickened, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. My hand started to tremble, and before I knew it, the phone slipped from my grip and hit the floor with a soft thud. I stared at it like it had come alive, like it might deliver another blow if I dared pick it up again. My fingers itched to grab it and read more, to dig through her messages and uncover everything. But another part of me wanted to smash it into a million pieces right there on the kitchen tile. Instead, I stood frozen, breathing heavy, trying to piece together the storm swirling in my head. Every scenario played out like a movie I couldn't shut off. Her sneaking around and waiting for her, their secret conversations. My mind was a prison, and I was the one locking the door. She wasn't home, and that fact alone made me feel sick. I didn't know if she was still with him, or if she'd just left the scene of her betrayal. My thoughts spiraled, each one darker than the last, but I forced myself to stop. I needed answers, not more chaos. I poured myself a glass of water, my hand shaking so badly that half of it spilled onto the counter. I drank it in one gulp, as if that could drown the fire raging inside me. The cold liquid did nothing to help. I kept seeing that message over and over again. I needed to hear her explanation, even if it tore me apart. The front door creaked open, and there she was. Her hair was slightly disheveled, her cheeks flushed like she'd been rushing, or no, I wouldn't let my mind go there yet. She smiled faintly when she saw me, but it faded as soon as she noticed the look on my face. "Hey," she said, her voice cautious. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The silence between us was louder than any argument could have been. She glanced down and saw her phone lying face up on the floor. Her lips parted slightly, and for a moment, I saw a panic flash across her face. But then she swallowed it, trying to compose herself. I watched her, waiting for her to say something, to explain herself before I tore into her. But she didn't. She just stood there, her eyes darting between me and the phone like she was calculating her next move. The room was suffocating. I felt like if I didn't say something soon, I'd explode. But instead of shouting, instead of crying or begging for an answer, I just stared at her coldly, letting the weight of what I'd seen settle between us. And I could tell she felt it too, because for the first time in a long while, she looked like a stranger. This wasn't the woman I married. This wasn't the life we built. And yet here we were, standing in the ruins. She bent down and picked up her phone, her fingers moving slowly like she was afraid it might burn her. I watched every movement, studying her like she was a puzzle I no longer understood. She didn't unlock the screen right away. Maybe she knew there was no point. I had seen enough. How long? My voice was low, calm even, but it felt like it belonged to someone else. Inside, I was a storm. She flinched at the question, her grip tightening on the phone. "It's not what you think," she whispered. I laughed, this dry, bitter sound that I hadn't meant to let out. "You don't even know what I think yet." Her shoulders sagged, like she'd already given up on trying to explain. Good, because I didn't want her excuses. I wanted the truth, raw and unfiltered. I wanted her to rip the bandage off completely, even if it left me bleeding out. She took a step toward me, but I raised a hand, stopping her in her tracks. Don't, I said. Just tell me how long this has been going on. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to be fooled by tears. She wiped them away quickly, like she knew they wouldn't work on me. 2 months, she said quietly, like she was confessing to some minor mistake. 2 months. The words hit me like a brick to the chest. I'd been living my life, going to work, planning our future, while she was sneaking around with a stranger. 2 months of lies. 2 months of pretending everything was fine. Why? I asked, my voice still cold. I wasn't going to break down. Not now. Her lip trembled, and she clutched her phone to her chest like it was some kind of shield. She shook her head and looked away, unable to meet my gaze. I don't know. You don't know? I repeated, my words sharp enough to cut through her. You destroyed us for what? A fling? A boy on Tinder? I watched her crumble in front of me. Her hands were shaking now, and her tears were coming faster. But she wasn't sobbing. No, she was holding it in, trying to stay composed, just like she had done with every lie she told me. It wasn't supposed to happen, she said, her voice cracking. I wasn't looking for it. She stopped herself, as if realizing that no excuse would be good enough. And she was right. You're telling me you accidentally downloaded Tinder and accidentally matched with some guy? And then, what? You accidentally slept with him? My words were venom, but I couldn't stop. She had opened this door, and now the flood was pouring through. She shook her head furiously. No, it wasn't like that. Then what was it like, huh? I asked, stepping closer, my eyes locked on hers. You tell me what part of this wasn't a deliberate choice. You tell me why you swiped right, why you met him, why you let him into our life. Because he's in it now, whether you like it or not. Her breath hitched, and she stumbled backward like my words had physically shoved her. She pressed her back against the wall, her phone slipping from her hand and landing on the floor again. I made a mistake, she whispered. I didn't mean for it to go this far. A mistake. That's what she called it. Like she had tripped and fallen into his bed. Like she hadn't made dozens of conscious decisions along the way. You didn't mean for it to go this far, I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. So, what? Were you planning on stopping after the first time? Or were you hoping I'd never find out, so you could keep this little game going? Her face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw real regret. Not the kind that people fake to cover their tracks, but the kind that comes when they realize they've ruined something they can't fix. I didn't want to hurt you, she said, her voice barely audible. Well, congratulations, I said coldly. You failed. She slid down the wall, sitting on the floor with her head buried in her hands. Her sobs were muffled, but I could still hear them. And for a second, a brief, fleeting second, I felt a twinge of something. Not pity, not forgiveness, but something like sadness for what we used to have. But that second passed, and I pushed it away. I couldn't afford to feel anything for her right now. I grabbed her phone off the floor and tossed it onto the coffee table, where it landed with a loud thud. I want to know everything, I said, my tone as cold as ever. Every detail. And don't you dare lie to me again. She looked up at me, her eyes swollen and red, and nodded. But I wasn't sure if I could trust her anymore. And that realization hit me harder than the message ever could. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater, her breath coming in shaky gasps. The woman I married, the one I trusted, sat crumpled on the floor like a broken version of herself. For a moment, I wondered if she had always been this fragile, and I just hadn't noticed. Or maybe this is what guilt did to someone. Either way, I wasn't ready to feel sorry for her. I pulled a chair out from the dining table and sat down across from her. My posture was rigid, my fingers tapping on the armrest as I waited. Start talking, I said. She sniffed and wiped her nose again. It wasn't about him, she said softly. It wasn't about anyone else. I raised an eyebrow. You expect me to believe this isn't about a guy you've been sleeping with for 2 months? Her hands trembled in her lap. I mean, it wasn't about him specifically. It could have been anyone. That statement hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to lash out, to yell that she had no right to say that as if it made her actions better. But I stayed quiet, letting her dig herself deeper. I felt she hesitated, struggling for the right words. I felt invisible. Her eyes locked onto mine, searching for some sign of understanding. I know it sounds stupid, but I felt like we weren't us anymore. You felt invisible, I repeated slowly. Because what? I wasn't paying enough attention to you. I didn't compliment your outfits. I didn't take you out to dinner every weekend. She flinched, but I wasn't done. So instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix it, you went on Tinder. You swiped through strangers, matched with some guy, and let him give you what you think I didn't. That's how you deal with feeling invisible. Her lip quivered, but she forced herself to answer. I didn't go looking for it, I swear. I downloaded the app one night because I was curious. I didn't think I'd actually meet anyone. And then Dylan messaged me, and at first it was just small talk. I wasn't even planning on meeting him, but you did. My voice cut through her confession like a knife. She nodded, fresh tears falling. It was only supposed to be once. I thought maybe if I just had that one experience, it would be enough. I could come home, and things would go back to normal. The laugh that escaped me was bitter and sharp. That's what you thought? That betraying me once would somehow reset everything like a magic button. I know how it sounds, she said, her voice breaking. I know I messed up, but when I met him, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. What did you feel? I asked, leaning forward. Excitement? Adventure? A thrill you thought I couldn't give you? She squeezed her eyes shut, as if closing them would block out my words. It wasn't like that, she whispered. Then tell me what it was like, I demanded. Because right now, all I see is a woman who wanted more than what she had and thought she could have it without consequences. Her sobs became heavier, her shoulders shaking with each breath. I felt alive, she finally admitted. Not because of him, but because it was something different. Something outside of this. She gestured around the room. This routine we've been stuck in. I sat back, absorbing her words. I wasn't naive enough to think our marriage had been perfect. We had our moments, weeks where we barely spoke outside of the necessary conversations, nights where the most we shared was a goodnight kiss. But I never imagined that was enough to push her into someone else's arms. So you cheated because you were bored, I said bluntly. No, she said quickly. It wasn't boredom. It was fear. I scoffed. Fear of what? Fear that we were fading, she said, her voice desperate. Fear that one day we'd wake up and realize we didn't love each other anymore. I thought if I did this, if I felt something different, I could come back to you and appreciate what we had again. I ran a hand down my face, my frustration boiling over. And how's that working out for you? Do you feel more appreciation now that you've betrayed me? Her head dropped into her hands, and she sobbed harder. I'm sorry, she choked out. I'm so sorry. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think this was just some mistake that we could fix. But the truth was, her apology didn't erase what she'd done. It didn't erase the image of her meeting some guy in secret, sharing parts of herself that were supposed to belong to me. You didn't just hurt me, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. You broke something I don't know if we can put back together. Her head shot up, panic flashing in her eyes. We can fix this, she said, crawling toward me on her knees. I'll do anything. I'll delete everything. Tinder, his number, anything. Please don't give up on us. I didn't respond. Not because I was considering it, but because I didn't have an answer. Part of me wanted to walk out the door and never look back. But another part of me wanted to stay, to punish her by making her face the consequences every day. I stood up and walked toward the window, staring out at the streetlights casting shadows on the pavement. Behind me, her sobs continued, echoing through the room like a soundtrack to our broken life. I wasn't sure which was worse, the fact that she had done this to me or the fact that, despite everything, I still didn't know what to do next. The next morning, the house felt colder. Not because of the temperature, but because something was missing, an invisible warmth that had once filled this place. The smell of coffee lingered faintly, but it didn't bring the same comfort it used to. My thoughts were heavier than the air around me as I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the blank wall in front of me. She was upstairs, probably waiting for me to make the next move. Last night had ended in silence. I couldn't stand her sobbing anymore, So I went to the guest room, locked the door, and laid there in the dark, listening to the muffled sound of her crying through the walls. It didn't make me feel better. Nothing did. I heard soft footsteps descending the stairs. I didn't turn around when she entered the kitchen. She was quiet, moving carefully, like any wrong step could trigger another explosion. She placed a mug of coffee on the table in front of me without a word. Her hands shook slightly, and I could see her struggling to keep herself together. "I didn't sleep," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Neither did I. I didn't bother looking at her. She sat down across from me, wrapping her hands around her own mug. I could feel her eyes on me, waiting for something. For anger, for forgiveness, for anything to break the unbearable stillness. But I wasn't going to make this easy for her. I didn't owe her that. "Please say something," she begged. "What do you want me to say?" I asked, finally meeting her gaze. "Do you want me to tell you I understand? That I'm willing to forget everything and move on like nothing happened?" "No," she said quickly. "I just want you to tell me what you're thinking." I leaned back in my chair, letting out a long breath. I'm thinking that the woman sitting across from me isn't the same woman I married. I'm thinking that everything I believed about us was a lie. And I'm thinking that no matter how much you say you're sorry, it doesn't erase what you did. She flinched as if I had slapped her. "I wasn't trying to replace you," she said, her voice cracking. "I never stopped loving you." "Loving me?" I scoffed. "Is that what you call it? Loving me while you were meeting someone else behind my back?" Her shoulders sagged, and she buried her face in her hands. "I know," she sobbed. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I ruined everything. But you have to believe me. I didn't mean for it to turn into this." I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "Stop saying you didn't mean it," I snapped. "You knew exactly what you were doing. Every time you messaged him, every time you met him, you knew. You just didn't think you'd get caught." Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't care. She needed to feel the weight of what she had done. I paced around the kitchen, my hands running through my hair as I tried to keep my anger in check. But the rage was bubbling over, and no matter how hard I tried to suppress it, it kept clawing its way out. "You didn't just cheat on me," I said, turning to face her. "You cheated on our life, on everything we built together. And now, I'm supposed to be the one to figure out how to fix it?" She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "I don't expect you to fix it," she whispered. "I just want a chance to prove that I can." I laughed bitterly. "A chance to prove what? That you're sorry now that you've been caught?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "A chance to prove that I still want this. That I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make you trust me again." Trust. The word felt foreign, like something I used to know, but had long since forgotten. How was I supposed to trust her when every time I looked at her, all I could see was the message on her phone? The image of her with him burned into my mind like a scar that wouldn't heal. "I don't know if I can do that," I admitted, my voice softer now. "I don't know if I want to." Her face crumpled, and she dropped her head into her hands again. I turned away, unable to watch her fall apart any longer. I grabbed my keys from the counter and headed toward the door. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice panicked. "I need to get out of here," I said without turning around. "Don't follow me." The door slammed shut behind me, and I walked to my car, my mind racing. I didn't know where I was going or what I was looking for. I just knew I couldn't stay in that house another minute. Not with her tears, her apologies, and the memories of what she had done suffocating me. I drove aimlessly, the city lights blurring past me as I tried to make sense of everything. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, but I ignored it. I didn't want to hear from her. I didn't want her trying to fix this when I hadn't even decided if it could be fixed. Eventually, I pulled into the parking lot of an old diner I used to go to when I was younger. It was nearly empty, the neon sign flickering in the night. I sat there for a while, staring at the faded building, wondering how my life had come to this. The sound of rain tapping against the windshield brought me back to reality. I leaned my head against the steering wheel, my breath fogging up the glass. I had come here looking for clarity, but all I found was more questions. How do you move forward when the person you trusted most is the one who betrayed you? How do you forgive someone who shattered your world and expects you to pick up the pieces? I didn't have the answers. Not yet. But I knew one thing. I wasn't ready to give her the chance she was begging for. Not until I figured out what I really wanted, The rain followed me home, drumming softly against the car as I pulled into the driveway. The house loomed in front of me, dark and silent, except for the faint light glowing from the living room window. She was still awake, probably waiting for me, probably hoping that I had cooled off. But I hadn't. If anything, the time away had only sharpened my anger into something colder, more calculated. My emotions had shifted from raw hysteria to something darker, a need for answers. Real ones this time. I stepped inside, and there she was, sitting on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her face was puffy, her eyes red and swollen. She looked up when she heard the door close, and for a moment, we just stared at each other in the dim light. "You came back," she whispered. "I didn't say I wouldn't," I replied, my voice devoid of warmth. I kicked off my shoes and walked past her, heading straight for the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, watching her cautiously as she followed me. "Did you think about what I said?" she asked, standing in the doorway like she was afraid to come any closer. "I thought about a lot of things," I said, setting the glass down. "But before we get into that, I need you to be honest with me." She nodded quickly, her eyes wide with desperation. "I will. I promise." I crossed my arms, keeping my gaze locked on her. Was he the only one? Her breath hitched, and for a second, I saw hesitation flash across her face. That second told me everything I needed to know. My stomach twisted, but I didn't let it show. "Answer me," I said, my tone sharp enough to slice through her defenses. She wiped her hands on the blanket, her fingers trembling. "There was someone else before him," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "It was brief. It didn't mean anything." I laughed bitterly. "Brief. Didn't mean anything. You're full of those phrases tonight, aren't you?" Tears welled up in her eyes again, but I didn't care. "Who?" I demanded. "When?" "It was last year," she said quickly. "Just one time. We met at a work event. I was drunk, and—" "Stop." I held up a hand, cutting her off. I didn't need to hear the details. The damage was already done. I turned away, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. My knuckles turned white, and I could feel the anger boiling just beneath the surface. She had been lying to me for longer than I thought. All those nights we had shared dinner, watched movies, talked about our future, she had been carrying this secret the entire time. "Why didn't you tell me before?" I asked, my voice low. "Because I was ashamed," she said, stepping closer. "I thought I could bury it and move on. I thought if I just focused on us, it wouldn't matter." I spun around, my eyes narrowing. "It matters," I said coldly. "It matters more than you'll ever understand." "I know," she sobbed. "I know I've ruined everything. But please, you have to believe me when I say that I want to fix this." I shook my head, disbelief washing over me. "You don't get it, do you? You didn't just betray me once or twice. You build a life around lies. You didn't give me a chance to fix anything because you never told me something was broken." She collapsed into a chair, her head in her hands. "I didn't mean for it to spiral like this," she whispered. There was again those words. "I didn't mean to." As if her intentions somehow made the betrayal less painful. I leaned against the counter, exhaling slowly as I tried to think. The logical part of me knew that walking out was the easiest solution. I could leave her to wallow in her regrets, pack up my things, and start fresh somewhere else. But the problem was, I wasn't sure if that's what I wanted. Part of me needed to know why she had been so willing to risk everything. What had driven her to not just one affair, but two? Was it boredom? Self-destruction? Or was there something I had overlooked, some truth I didn't want to face? I looked back at her, my mind racing. "You said you felt invisible," I said, repeating her earlier words. "But you had to know that wasn't true. I noticed you. I was there. What were you really looking for?" She lifted her head, her eyes glassy and lost. "I don't know," she whispered. "Maybe I wanted to feel like I could still be wanted by someone new. Maybe I was scared that after so many years, you saw me differently. Less exciting, less worth chasing." "That's the problem," I said bitterly. "I never stopped chasing you. I didn't need newness to remind me why I married you. But apparently you did." Her lips trembled as she tried to respond, but I wasn't interested in more apologies. I pushed away from the counter and paced the kitchen, running my hands through my hair. You say you want to fix this, I said. But how can you fix something when you've torn it down to the foundation? I'll do anything, she said, her voice trembling. Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. I'll prove to you that I can be the person you deserve. I stopped pacing and stared at her, the woman who had become a stranger overnight. The person I deserve? I repeated. Maybe you were never that person to begin with. Her face paled, and for a moment, I thought she might pass out. But she didn't. She sat there, absorbing my words, knowing that they cut deeper than any argument we could have had. The silence between us stretched on, suffocating and heavy. Eventually, I grabbed my jacket from the chair and slipped it on. Where are you going now? She asked weakly. Out, I said, not bothering to elaborate. I needed space. Time. Distance from the woman who had unraveled everything we built. As I stepped outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and cold. I walked down the street, not knowing where I was headed, but determined to find a clarity I couldn't seem to grasp inside that house. I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to forgive her. And worse, I wasn't sure if I even wanted to. I didn't come home that night. Instead, I found myself parked at the edge of the city in an empty lot overlooking the river. The water rippled under the moonlight, calm and indifferent, the exact opposite of what I felt. I had my phone in my hand, her number glowing on the screen, but I couldn't bring myself to call her. There was nothing left to say, and even if there was, I wasn't ready to hear more of her pleas. My thoughts shifted back to her confession about the second affair, the one she had kept hidden for over a year. I wondered what other secrets were buried in our marriage, waiting to be uncovered like landmines beneath the surface. Maybe this wasn't the last betrayal. Maybe she was just running out of time to keep the others hidden. I gripped the steering wheel and let out a long, shaky breath. The smart thing to do would be to end it, cut her out like a tumor, and move on with my life. But my heart wasn't as smart as my mind, and that was the problem. I couldn't forget the good parts of our life, the memories that still clung to me like ghosts. The sound of my phone vibrating pulled me back to the present. It wasn't her calling. It was a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I'd ignore it, but something about tonight made me reckless. I answered. Hello. The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost nervous. Is this her husband? I stiffened. Who's asking? There was a pause, and then, it's Dylan. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. What the hell do you want? I didn't know she was married, he said quickly, as if that would somehow make things better. I swear I didn't know until tonight. She told me everything, and I figured you deserved to know what really happened. What really happened? I repeated bitterly. I think I've heard enough. No, he said, his voice urgent. You don't know the whole story. I considered hanging up, but something in his tone made me stay. Fine, I said through gritted teeth. Talk. He exhaled, like he'd been holding his breath. I met her on Tinder, yeah, but she wasn't just some bored wife looking for a fling. She was broken. She talked about how she felt like she was losing herself, how she didn't know who she was anymore, and you thought you could fix her? I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. No, he said softly. I wasn't trying to fix her. I think she just wanted someone who wasn't part of her real life. Someone who wouldn't remind her of everything she was afraid of losing. I clenched my jaw, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy fog. So, what? You were her escapes? Yeah, he admitted. But it wasn't just physical. We talked about her fears about you, about the life she felt trapped in. Trapped? I repeated, my chest tightening. She told you she felt trapped? Not in the way you think, he said quickly. She loved you. She talked about you all the time. But she was scared that the version of herself you loved didn't exist anymore. She thought you wouldn't want the woman she had become. I let his words sink in, the pieces of the puzzle shifting and rearranging in my mind. I had spent so much time being angry at her for betraying me, angry at myself for not seeing the signs, that I hadn't considered the possibility that her betrayal wasn't just about me. It was about her. Dylan continued, his voice softer now. She told me she wanted to end things with me a few weeks ago, but I guess I was too stubborn to let go. I'm sorry for that. I didn't mean to make things worse. I didn't respond. What was there to say? His apology didn't erase what had happened. But for the first time, I wasn't just seeing her as the villain of this story. I was seeing her as someone who had been drowning and chose the wrong way to stay afloat. She doesn't know I'm calling you, Dylan said after a pause. I just thought you should know the truth before you make any decisions. I ended the call without saying goodbye. My mind was spinning, torn between anger and something that felt dangerously close to understanding. I sat there in the car for what felt like hours, replaying the conversation in my head, trying to make sense of it all. Eventually, I drove back home. The house was dark when I walked in, except for the faint glow of the hallway light. I found her in our bedroom, curled up on the bed with her phone lying next to her. She was asleep, her breathing steady, but her face was still stained with tears. I sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at her. She looked so fragile, like the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. The woman who had made me laugh, who had shared every milestone with me, who had promised me forever. But forever was broken now, and I wasn't sure if I could ever fix it. I leaned down and gently shook her awake. Her eyes fluttered open, and when she saw me, they filled with relief and fear all at once. "I thought you weren't coming back," she whispered. "I talked to Dylan," I said, my voice steady. Her body tensed, and for a moment, she looked like she might shatter again. "What did he tell you?" "Everything," I said. "About how you felt, about why you did it." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't say anything. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I'm not saying I forgive you," I said, "and I'm not saying this can be fixed. But if we're going to figure out what's next, you need to be honest with me. No more lies. No more secrets. You tell me everything, even if it hurts." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I will," she whispered. "I promise." I leaned back, the weight of her words pressing down on me. This wasn't a decision I could make overnight. Trust didn't rebuild itself with promises. It took time, and I wasn't sure if we had enough left. But for now, I stayed, because walking away might be easy, but facing the truth, that was the real challenge. And part of me, despite everything, wasn't ready to give up just yet.